Case 1. Shaylynn Curtis, The Attic Secret. Our first case takes us to October 25, 2021, a date that would forever change a Kentucky community and expose a mother's unthinkable actions. Shaylynn Curtis seemed, to the outside world, like any other young mother navigating the challenges of raising an infant. Her 5-month-old son was at that precious stage where every day brings new developments, new sounds, new expressions, new glimpses of the person he would become. But that little boy would never get the chance to grow up, to take his first steps, to speak his first words, to experience the life that every child deserves. On that October day, something went terribly, catastrophically wrong in the Curtis household. The baby, just 5 months old, barely half a year into his life, died of acute methamphetamine intoxication while in his mother's care. Let that sink in for a moment. A 5-month-old infant. Methamphetamine. In his system. At lethal levels. The questions that immediately arise are almost too painful to contemplate. How does a baby, an infant who depends entirely on his mother for every need, every comfort, every measure of safety, end up with methamphetamine in his system? Was it environmental exposure in a home where the drug was being manufactured or used? Was it through breast milk? Was it deliberate? The specifics of how this precious child came into contact with such a deadly substance remain part of the ongoing investigation and legal proceedings. But what Shaylynn Curtis did next transforms this from a case of tragic negligence into something far more sinister, something that speaks to a consciousness of guilt and a complete abandonment of maternal instinct. When her baby died, when she realized that her 5-month-old son was no longer breathing, no longer moving, no longer alive, Curtis didn't call 911. She didn't rush him to a hospital in a desperate attempt to save his life. She didn't cry out for help. She didn't do any of the things that a parent would instinctively do when their child is in distress. Instead, Shaylynn Curtis made a choice that defies comprehension. She wrapped her baby's tiny body in a blanket. And then she carried him up to the attic of her Kentucky home. She placed him there, concealed from the world, hidden away like a secret too shameful to acknowledge. And then she went on with her life. Think about that for a moment. A mother, climbing the stairs to her attic, carrying the wrapped body of her infant son, the weight of him in her arms, still warm, perhaps. The finality of placing him down and walking away. The days that followed, living in a house with her child's body decomposing above her head, eating meals, sleeping, going about daily routines, all while her baby lay dead in the darkness overhead. How long did this go on? Days? Weeks? What was going through Curtis's mind during this time? Did she think she could hide it forever? Did she experience guilt, remorse, fear? Or had something in her psyche broken so completely that she was able to compartmentalize this horror and function normally? Eventually, inevitably, the truth came to light. Authorities were alerted to investigate the child's unexplained death. One can only imagine the moment when investigators made the grim discovery in that attic. The small, blanket-wrapped form that should have been cradled in loving arms, not hidden away in the dark. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of what had happened. Medical examiners determined that the cause of death was acute methamphetamine intoxication. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't sudden infant death syndrome. This was a child who died because he was exposed to a dangerous, illegal substance while in his mother's care. Shaylynn Curtis was indicted on murder charges. The state determined that her actions, whether through direct administration of the drug, reckless environmental exposure, or criminal negligence, constituted murder. Additionally, she faced charges of abuse of a corpse for her decision to conceal her son's body rather than report his death and allow him the dignity of a proper investigation and burial. The legal distinction is important here. Abuse of a corpse charges recognize that even in death, human beings, especially children, deserve respect and proper treatment. By hiding her son's body, Curtis not only obstructed justice and prevented a timely investigation, but she also denied her child the basic human dignity that every person deserves, even after death. As Curtis's case moved through the Kentucky legal system, the community grappled with trying to understand how such a thing could happen. Neighbors who might have seen Curtis and her baby in passing, perhaps at a grocery store or walking down the street, struggled with the knowledge that they had been so close to a tragedy without knowing it. Child welfare advocates used the case to highlight the ongoing opioid and methamphetamine crisis affecting Kentucky and its devastating impact on the state's most vulnerable residents, its children. The Curtis case also raised broader questions about the intersection of addiction and parenting. Kentucky, like many states, has been ravaged by the opioid epidemic, and methamphetamine use has surged in rural and urban areas alike. When parents struggle with addiction, their children often pay the highest price. But at what point does addiction become an excuse rather than an explanation? At what point must we hold parents accountable for the choices they make, regardless of their own struggles? These are not easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But what remains clear is that a 5-month-old baby is dead, a child who had barely begun to experience life, who knew nothing of the world except what his mother showed him. And in the end, what she showed him was not love, not protection, not the fierce maternal devotion that should be every child's birthright. Instead, she showed him a home filled with dangerous drugs. And when those drugs killed him, she showed him the darkness of an attic, where he lay alone and forgotten. The Curtis case stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest danger to a child comes not from strangers or random violence, but from the very person who should be their greatest protector. It's a reminder that behind closed doors, in homes that look no different from any others on the street, unimaginable tragedies can unfold. And it's a reminder that in Kentucky, as in every state, there are children right now who are at risk, children whose mothers struggle with addiction, mental illness, or simply the overwhelming pressures of parenthood without adequate support. The question we must ask ourselves is, what are we doing to help those children before it's too late? Shaylynn Curtis awaits her day in court, where a jury will hear the full details of what happened to her son and determine her fate. But for that 5-month-old baby boy, justice will come too late. His brief life ended in a way no child should ever have to endure, and his death serves as a tragic testament to the consequences when a mother's duty to protect is abandoned. If this case has affected you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light and raise awareness about child safety issues. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Case 2. Zeinab Abdi, the hammer attack. We now move to a much more recent case, one that occurred just months ago on June 19, 2025, in Louisville, Kentucky's largest city. This case is particularly disturbing because of its sheer brutality, its premeditated nature, and the fact that as of this recording, a young girl is still fighting for her life, recovering from injuries that no child should ever have to endure. Zeinab Abdi was a mother living in Louisville, a city known for its bourbon, its baseball bats, and the Kentucky Derby. It's a city of neighborhoods where families raise their children, where communities come together, where life proceeds with a reassuring normalcy. But on that June day, in one home in Louisville, something happened that shattered any sense of normalcy or safety. According to police reports and charging documents, Abdi took a hammer, a common household tool, the kind you might use to hang a picture or assemble furniture, and she used it to strike her young daughter in the head. Not once, multiple times. The attack was so severe that the little girl suffered multiple skull fractures. Her skull, the very bone structure that protects the brain, that nature designed to keep us safe, was fractured in multiple places from the force of her mother's blows. Emergency responders rushed the child to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save her life and assess the extent of her injuries. The medical reports painted a grim picture. Multiple skull fractures, critical injury. A child whose mother, the person who should have been her protector, had instead become her attacker. This wasn't an accident. You don't accidentally strike your child multiple times with a hammer. You don't accidentally fracture their skull in multiple places. This was an assault, deliberate, brutal, and directed at the most vulnerable target imaginable, a young child, by her own mother. Zeinab Abdi was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The charge tells us something important. Prosecutors believe that Abdi's actions were intended to kill her daughter. This wasn't charged as assault, or child abuse, or reckless endangerment. This was attempted murder, a charge reserved for situations where the evidence suggests that the perpetrator intended to end another person's life. What drives a mother to such an act? What was happening in Zeinab Abdi's mind, in her life, in that household? that led to this moment of unspeakable violence? Mental health crisis? Psychotic break? Postpartum depression or psychosis, even years after childbirth? Substance abuse? Rage at the child for reasons we can't fathom? Or simply evil? Pure, inexplicable evil that sometimes emerges in human beings regardless of the biological bonds that should inspire love and protection? We may never fully understand the why behind this case. But what we do know is that a little girl, who should have been able to trust her mother absolutely, who should have found in her mother's safety and love, instead found violence and betrayal. As of this recording, the child is recovering, but the long-term effects of such an assault are difficult to predict. Multiple skull fractures can lead to traumatic brain injury, with effects that might not be fully apparent for months or years. There could be cognitive impacts, motor skill challenges, behavioral changes, or other consequences that will affect this child for the rest of her life. And beyond the physical injuries, there are the psychological wounds. How does a child recover from being attacked by her mother? How does she learn to trust adults, to feel safe in the world, to form healthy attachments, when the first and most important attachment of her life, to her mother, was violently severed? The child will need extensive therapy, medical care, and support. One hopes that she has other family members, a father, grandparents, aunts, uncles, who can provide the love and stability she needs. One hopes that the state's child welfare system will ensure she never has to face her mother again unless and until it's proven beyond doubt that she would be safe. Zeinab Abdi's case is still working its way through the court system. She faces attempted murder charges, and if convicted, she could spend decades in prison. But the legal resolution, whatever it may be, won't undo what happened to that little girl. It won't erase the trauma. It won't repair the broken bond between mother and child. The Louisville community reacted with horror when news of the attack became public. Neighbors expressed shock, saying they had never seen signs of trouble. But isn't that always the case? How often do we hear, after such tragedies, that the family seemed normal, that there were no warning signs, that we never would have suspected? The truth is, violence against children often happens behind closed doors, hidden from neighbors and community members who might otherwise intervene. And sometimes, even when there are warning signs, they're missed or ignored or not reported. This case reminds us of the importance of vigilance, not paranoia, but a caring awareness of the children in our communities. If you see signs of abuse, if you hear things that concern you, if a child tells you something that raises red flags, please report it. Call your state's child abuse hotline. You might be wrong. You might feel embarrassed, but you might also save a life. Because while this little girl survived her mother's attack, she will live with the consequences forever. And there are other children out there, right now, who are at risk. Children whose mothers are struggling with mental illness, addiction, rage, or other issues that put their kids in danger. We can't save every child, but we can try. We can be aware. We can report concerns. We can support programs that provide mental health services, addiction treatment, parenting classes, and other resources that might prevent the next tragedy. Zeinab Abdi made a choice on June 19, 2025, a choice that changed her life and her daughter's life forever. Now we, as a society, must make our own choices about how we respond to such cases and what we do to protect the vulnerable children in our midst. The hammer that Abdi allegedly used against her daughter is now evidence in a criminal case. But it's also a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the tools of ordinary domestic life can become weapons, and that the greatest threat to a child's safety isn't always a stranger or an external danger. Sometimes it's the person who lives in the same house, the person whose DNA they share, the person who should love them most. Don't forget to like this video, comment with your thoughts on how we can better protect children in our communities, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people and potentially saves lives. Case 3. Tiffanie Lucas, the Bullitt County Massacre. On November 8, 2023, in Bullitt County, Kentucky, emergency responders received a call that would lead them to a scene of unimaginable horror. 2 children, brothers aged 6 and 9 years old, were found inside their home with gunshot wounds. Both boys would later die from their injuries. And their mother, Tiffanie Lucas, would be charged with their murder, a charge she would eventually plead guilty to, admitting that she had taken the lives of her own children. This case is particularly haunting because of what it represents. Not a moment of rage, not an accident, not a single terrible decision, but the deliberate murder of 2 children, methodically planned and executed by the one person they should have been able to trust absolutely. 6 and 9 years old. Let's pause to consider what that means. These weren't infants who depended on their mother for every need. These were school-age children. The 6-year-old was likely in kindergarten or first grade, learning to read, making friends, discovering his interests. The 9-year-old was probably in 3rd or 4th grade, old enough to have developed his own personality, his own hopes and dreams, his own relationships outside the family. These boys had lives. They had teachers who knew them, classmates who played with them, neighbors who saw them riding bikes or playing in the yard. They had favorite foods, favorite TV shows, favorite toys. They were real, fully formed little people with futures ahead of them, futures that their mother stole. The details of what happened inside that Bullitt County home on November 8th remain, in many ways, a mystery. What we know is that at some point, Tiffanie Lucas obtained a gun, and she used it to shoot both of her sons. The fact that both boys were shot suggests this wasn't an impulsive act involving one child. This was a decision to kill both of them. Did she shoot them while they slept? While they played? While they begged for their lives? Did the older boy, at 9, understand what was happening? Did he try to protect his younger brother? Did the 6-year-old call out for his mother even as she aimed the gun at him? These are the questions that haunt investigators, prosecutors, and anyone who learns about this case. These are the images that are impossible to shake. The terror those boys must have felt, the betrayal, the incomprehension of why their mother, their protector, had become their killer. After the shootings, someone, presumably Lucas herself, called for help. Emergency responders arrived to find both boys with gunshot wounds. They were rushed to the hospital, but their injuries were too severe. Both children died, their brief lives cut short by the person who gave them life. Tiffanie Lucas was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. As the case proceeded through the court system, the community demanded answers. What could possibly drive a mother to kill both of her children? Was she suffering from postpartum psychosis, even years after giving birth? Was she in the grip of a severe mental illness that distorted her perception of reality? Had she experienced a psychotic break that made her believe she was protecting her children from some imagined threat? Or was this something else entirely? A calculated decision by a woman who, for whatever reason, no longer wanted to be a mother and saw murder as her solution? The prosecution gathered evidence, built their case, and prepared to go to trial. But before the case could be heard by a jury, something significant happened. Tiffanie Lucas entered a guilty plea. By pleading guilty, Lucas admitted her responsibility for her sons' deaths. She acknowledged that she had murdered them. This guilty plea meant that there would be no trial, no presentation of evidence in open court, no testimony from witnesses that might have shed light on what happened that November day. For some, the guilty plea provided a form of justice, an admission of guilt from the killer herself, a legal resolution that meant the community could move forward. For others, particularly those seeking to understand how such a thing could happen, the plea was frustrating, leaving many questions unanswered. Why did she do it? What was her mental state? Were there warning signs that were missed? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Lucas's sentencing would provide at least some answers and some measure of justice for the 2 little boys who lost their lives. The judge would consider the facts of the case, Lucas's mental health history if any, and the impact on the community before determining an appropriate sentence. But no sentence, however severe, can undo what was done. No amount of prison time can bring back 2 young boys who should still be alive, growing up, experiencing all the joys and challenges of childhood and adolescence. No punishment can truly balance the scales when the victims are children murdered by their own mother. The Bullitt County community was devastated by this case. Schools held counseling sessions for students who knew the boys. Neighbors struggled to process the horror that had unfolded in their quiet community. And across Kentucky, parents held their children a little tighter, grateful for what they had and mourning what was lost. This case also reignited conversations about gun safety and access. How did Tiffanie Lucas obtain the gun she used to kill her children? Was it legally purchased? Was it stored safely, or was it easily accessible? Kentucky has relatively permissive gun laws, but those laws are predicated on the assumption that gun owners will be responsible and won't use firearms to commit crimes, especially not against children. When a mother uses a gun to murder her children, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the intersection of gun rights, mental health, and public safety. These aren't easy discussions, and they often become politically charged. But they're discussions we must have if we want to prevent future tragedies. The Tiffanie Lucas case stands as one of Kentucky's most heartbreaking maternal filicide cases, the murder of children by their mother. It's a case that defies easy explanation and resists simple solutions. All we're left with is grief for two young boys who deserved so much more, and a commitment to do better, to identify struggling parents before they reach a breaking point, to provide mental health resources, and to protect children at all costs. As we move forward, let's remember those two brothers, their lives cut short at 6 and 9 years old, and let's work to ensure that no other children suffer the same fate. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Share this with others who care about child safety, and let's keep the conversation going about how we can protect our most vulnerable. Case 4. Erica Lawson, the slow death. In late July 2023, a 17-month-old child was rushed by air ambulance to a children's hospital in a desperate attempt to save her life. The toddler was suffering from severe injuries that doctors quickly determined were not the result of an accident, but rather the outcome of prolonged abuse and neglect. Despite the best efforts of medical professionals, the little girl succumbed to her injuries. She died having known, in her brief 17 months of life, not the love and care that every child deserves, but pain, suffering, and neglect at the hands of her mother, Erica Lawson. This case is distinct from some of the others we've discussed because it wasn't a single moment of violence, a one-time decision that ended a child's life. This was prolonged abuse, sustained, repeated harm inflicted over time on a child who was too young to defend herself, too young to seek help, too young even to articulate what was being done to her. 17 months old, not quite a year and a half. At that age, children are just beginning to walk steadily, to say simple words, to assert their independence in small ways. They're at that delightful stage where everything is new and fascinating, where the world is full of things to explore and discover. A 17-month-old should be learning, playing, bonding with caregivers, and developing the foundation of trust and security that will support them throughout their life. But this child's experience was nothing like that. Instead of care, she received abuse. Instead of comfort, she experienced pain. And instead of the consistent, loving attention that children need, she suffered neglect that allowed her injuries to worsen until they became fatal. What exactly happened to this little girl? The medical evidence told a grim story. Her injuries were severe enough that she had to be flown to a specialized children's hospital. The fact that the injuries were determined to result from prolonged abuse and neglect tells us that this wasn't a single incident. This was a pattern of behavior by Erica Lawson that continued over days, weeks, or possibly even months. Prolonged abuse can take many forms. It might involve repeated physical violence, hitting, shaking, or otherwise harming the child. It might involve deprivation, withholding food, water, medical care, or other necessities. It might involve exposure to dangerous conditions or substances. Often, it's a combination of factors that, over time, erode a child's health until their small body can no longer cope. The neglect component is equally important. Medical neglect occurs when a parent fails to seek appropriate medical care for a child's injuries or illness. Given that this child's condition deteriorated to the point where emergency air transport was necessary, it's clear that Lawson failed to seek medical attention long before the situation became critical. Think about what that means. At some point, this toddler's injuries or illness would have been visible. She would have been in pain. She might have been crying, refusing to eat, showing signs of distress. Any attentive parent would have recognized that something was wrong and sought medical help. But Lawson didn't. She allowed her daughter's condition to worsen, allowed her pain to continue, allowed preventable suffering to go untreated. By the time the child finally did receive medical attention, it was too late. The injuries were too severe. The neglect had gone on too long. Despite the advanced pediatric care available at the children's hospital, the little girl died. An investigation was launched immediately. When a child dies under suspicious circumstances, especially a young child with signs of abuse, law enforcement and Child Protective Services conduct a thorough investigation to determine what happened and who was responsible. In this case, the evidence pointed clearly to Erica Lawson. She was the child's mother and primary caregiver. The injuries occurred while the child was in her care. The pattern of prolonged abuse and neglect indicated ongoing behavior, not a one-time incident that might be attributed to someone else. Lawson was indicted on murder charges, along with related charges stemming from the abuse and neglect. An indictment means that a grand jury, a panel of citizens who review evidence, determined that there was sufficient evidence to believe that Lawson had committed these crimes and should stand trial. The murder charge is significant. Kentucky law recognizes that causing a child's death through abuse or neglect can constitute murder, even if the perpetrator didn't intend to kill the child. The legal theory is that by engaging in conduct that creates a grave risk of death, such as severe abuse or withholding necessary medical care, and that conduct results in death, the perpetrator has demonstrated the extreme indifference to human life that constitutes murder. Lawson's case proceeded through the court system over the following months. The prosecution prepared to present evidence of the child's injuries, expert testimony about the prolonged nature of the abuse, and other evidence establishing Lawson's guilt. The defense, presumably, would have explored potential mitigating factors, mental illness, postpartum issues, difficult life circumstances that might explain, if not excuse, Lawson's behavior. But in May 2025, nearly 2 years after her daughter's death, Erica Lawson entered a guilty plea. By doing so, she admitted her responsibility for her child's death. She acknowledged that her actions, her abuse and neglect, had killed her 17-month-old daughter. The guilty plea meant that Lawson would be sentenced without a trial. The judge would determine an appropriate punishment based on the severity of the crime, Lawson's criminal history if any, and other relevant factors. Given that this involved the death of a child through prolonged abuse, the sentence was likely to be substantial, potentially decades in prison. But again, as with all these cases, no amount of punishment can undo what was done. A toddler who should still be alive, who should be 3 or 4 years old now, playing, learning, experiencing the joy of childhood, is dead. Her life was extinguished by the person who should have protected her most fiercely. The Lawson case highlights several important issues. First, it demonstrates the importance of community awareness and intervention. Prolonged abuse doesn't happen in an instant. There's a period of time during which the abuse is ongoing and potentially visible to others. Did anyone see signs? Did family members, neighbors, or others in the community notice anything that concerned them? If so, was it reported? If not, why not? Second, this case underscores the critical importance of medical care for children. When a child is ill or injured, seeking prompt medical attention isn't optional. It's a legal and moral obligation. Doctors are trained to recognize signs of abuse and neglect, and they're mandated reporters who must report suspicions to authorities. If Lawson had sought medical care for her daughter earlier, the abuse might have been detected, the child could have been removed from danger, and her life might have been saved. Third, the case raises questions about what resources were, or weren't, available to Erica Lawson. Was she struggling with mental illness? Substance abuse? The overwhelming stress of single parenthood? Were there support services available that she didn't access, or did she reach out for help only to be turned away? Understanding the context doesn't excuse her actions, but it can inform our efforts to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The death of Lawson's 17-month-old daughter is a tragedy that ripples outward, affecting not just the immediate family, but the entire community. It's a reminder that children are vulnerable, dependent on adults for their very survival, and that when those adults fail in their duty to protect, the consequences are devastating. As Erica Lawson serves her sentence, one can only hope that she reflects on what she did and feels the full weight of her actions. And one can only hope that somewhere, somehow, her daughter's brief life and tragic death will inspire changes that protect other children from suffering the same fate. If you found this case as heartbreaking as I did, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. Let's work together to raise awareness about child abuse and the resources available to prevent it. Case 5. Lauren Baker, the fentanyl tragedy. On March 18, 2021, in the small city of Ludlow, Kentucky, a tragedy unfolded that would expose the deadly intersection of the opioid crisis and parental responsibility. Lauren Baker's toddler son found and ingested her stash of fentanyl, one of the most potent and deadly opioids known to medicine. The little boy overdosed and died, his brief life cut short by a drug that has claimed tens of thousands of American lives in recent years. This case is different from some of the others we've examined. There's no evidence that Lauren Baker wanted her son to die, that she deliberately harmed him, or that she was abusing him in the traditional sense. What she did do was keep a lethal quantity of fentanyl in her home where her toddler could access it. And that decision, that negligence, that reckless endangerment of her child, resulted in his death. To understand this case, we need to understand fentanyl. It's a synthetic opioid that's approximately 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. In medical settings, it's used for severe pain management, often for cancer patients or in surgical contexts. But on the streets, fentanyl has become a scourge, often mixed with other drugs or sold as counterfeit prescription pills. The drug is so potent that an amount smaller than a few grains of salt can be lethal. And because it's often mixed with other substances, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, or pressed into pills that look like legitimate prescription medications, users sometimes don't even know they're taking fentanyl until it's too late. Kentucky has been hit particularly hard by the opioid epidemic. The state has one of the highest rates of drug overdose deaths in the nation. Rural communities have been devastated by addiction, and the introduction of fentanyl into the drug supply has made an already deadly crisis even worse. Lauren Baker was part of this crisis. She was using fentanyl, and she had a stash of it in her home, the same home where she was raising her toddler's son. Toddlers are naturally curious. They explore their environment by touching everything, putting things in their mouths, investigating drawers and cabinets, and anywhere else they can reach. It's how they learn about the world. But this natural curiosity becomes deadly when dangerous substances are within their reach. On March 18th, Baker's son found her fentanyl. Perhaps it was in a purse left within reach. Perhaps it was in a drawer that wasn't properly secured. Perhaps it was out in the open. However it happened, the toddler got hold of the drug and ingested it. Given fentanyl's extreme potency, even a tiny amount would have been enough to cause an overdose in a small child. The drug would have rapidly depressed his breathing and central nervous system. He might have become sleepy, then unresponsive. His lips might have turned blue from lack of oxygen. He might have stopped breathing altogether. Did Lauren Baker realize what was happening? Did she try to help? Did she call for emergency services? Or did she delay, perhaps afraid of legal consequences? The timeline isn't entirely clear, but what we know is that despite any efforts that may have been made, the little boy died from fentanyl poisoning. The death of a child is always investigated thoroughly, and when drugs are involved, criminal charges are often filed. In Baker's case, prosecutors determined that her actions constituted more than simple negligence. They charged her with wanton murder, a legal term that means causing someone's death through conduct that shows an extreme indifference to the value of human life. The legal theory is straightforward. Baker knew she had fentanyl in her home. She knew she had a toddler in her home. She knew, or should have known, that fentanyl is deadly, especially to children. Yet she failed to secure the drug properly, failed to keep it out of her child's reach, and thereby created a risk so grave that her son's death became not just a tragic accident, but a crime. The case went to trial. A jury heard evidence about Baker's drug use, about the circumstances of her son's death, about the fentanyl found in his system and in her home. They heard expert testimony about fentanyl's potency and lethality. They heard from investigators about what they found at the scene. And ultimately, that jury returned a verdict, guilty. Lauren Baker was convicted of wanton murder and other drug-related charges stemming from her son's death. The conviction was significant. It sent a message that parents who use drugs have a heightened responsibility to keep those substances away from their children, and that failing to do so, with fatal consequences, is a crime that will be punished. But the legal proceedings didn't end with the conviction. Baker appealed, challenging her conviction and sentence on various legal grounds. These appeals wound their way through Kentucky's court system, eventually reaching the Kentucky Supreme Court, the highest court in the state. In a decision that was closely watched by prosecutors, defense attorneys, and public health officials throughout Kentucky, the Supreme Court upheld Baker's conviction and her sentence of 33 years in prison. The court determined that the evidence supported the jury's verdict, that the trial had been conducted fairly, and that the sentence was appropriate given the severity of the crime. 33 years. Baker will likely be in her 50s or 60s before she's released from prison, having spent decades behind bars for a crime that took seconds to occur but will echo through the rest of her life. The Baker case raises difficult questions about addiction, criminal justice, and parental responsibility. On one hand, Lauren Baker was herself a victim of the opioid crisis, addicted to a substance that destroys lives and tears families apart. Addiction is recognized as a disease, a chronic condition that requires treatment, not just punishment. On the other hand, Baker was a mother with a fundamental duty to protect her child. Her addiction doesn't excuse her responsibility to keep dangerous substances away from her toddler. And while we can feel compassion for her struggle with addiction, we must also hold her accountable for the consequences of her choices. This case also highlights the broader public health crisis surrounding opioids, and specifically fentanyl. Baker's son is far from the only child to die from accidental fentanyl exposure. Across the country, emergency rooms are seeing an increase in pediatric overdoses, children who ingest their parents' drugs, often with fatal results. Public health officials have responded with education campaigns aimed at parents who use drugs, emphasizing the importance of securing substances in locked containers, keeping them out of children's reach, and seeking treatment for addiction before tragedy strikes. Some harm reduction programs now offer lockboxes specifically designed to keep medications and drugs away from children. But education and harm reduction can only go so far when we're dealing with substances as deadly as fentanyl. The margin for error is zero. There's no safe way to keep fentanyl in a home with children, just as there's no safe amount of fentanyl for a toddler to ingest. The only truly safe solution is for parents to get treatment for their addiction, to get clean, and to remove dangerous substances from their homes entirely. But that's easier said than done in a state like Kentucky, where treatment resources are limited, where stigma around addiction remains strong, and where the cycle of poverty, trauma, and substance abuse can feel impossible to break. Lauren Baker's son paid the ultimate price for his mother's addiction and negligence. He was a toddler who should have been learning his colors and shapes, taking his first steps toward independence, experiencing the security of a safe home. Instead, his curiosity led him to a deadly drug, and his life ended far too soon. Baker herself is now serving a lengthy prison sentence, removed from society, punished for her crime. But punishment doesn't bring her son back. It doesn't undo the tragedy. It doesn't solve the opioid crisis that creates new victims every day. What it does do is send a clear message. Parents are responsible for protecting their children, and when they fail in that responsibility with fatal consequences, they will be held accountable. It's a harsh message, delivered through a harsh sentence, but perhaps it's a necessary one in an epidemic that has already claimed too many young lives. The city of Ludlow, a small community along the Ohio River, was forever changed by this case. Neighbors remember seeing Baker and her son before the tragedy, a young mother with a toddler, looking like so many other families. They never imagined what was happening behind closed doors, never knew about the addiction that was putting that little boy at risk. And that's perhaps the most haunting aspect of this case. It could happen anywhere, in any community, in any home where addiction and children intersect. Lauren Baker wasn't a monster. She was an addict who made terrible choices, and those choices cost her son his life and cost her own freedom. As Kentucky continues to grapple with the opioid crisis, cases like Baker's serve as tragic reminders of what's at stake. It's not just about adults who overdose, though those deaths are tragic too. It's about the children who are collateral damage in a drug epidemic. Children like Baker's son, who died because the adults responsible for protecting them failed in their duty. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour if you believe in holding people accountable while also addressing the root causes of tragedies like this. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on how we can better protect children in homes affected by addiction. Case 6. Brianna Morgan Burkhart, the infant's suffering. On April 20th, 2024, emergency services in Kentucky received a call that would lead to one of the most disturbing cases of infant abuse the state had seen in years. A 3-month-old baby girl had been brought to the hospital with injuries so severe, so extensive, and so obviously non-accidental that doctors immediately recognized they were dealing with a case of child abuse. The infant's injuries were catastrophic. She had multiple fractures, broken bones in various stages of healing, indicating that the abuse had been ongoing over time. She had hemorrhages, internal bleeding that spoke to violent trauma, and she had retinal bleeding, damage to the eyes that's often seen in cases of severe shaking or head trauma in infants. This constellation of injuries painted a horrifying picture. A tiny baby, just 3 months old, who had been subjected to repeated, severe physical abuse. And the person identified as responsible for this abuse was her mother, Brianna Burkhart, who also went by the name Morgan. 3 months old. To put that in perspective, at 3 months, babies are just beginning to smile socially, to track objects with their eyes, to recognize familiar faces. They're entirely helpless, completely dependent on their caregivers for every need. They can't protect themselves, can't escape danger, can't even communicate what's being done to them beyond crying. And even that fundamental expression of distress requires someone to listen and respond appropriately. This baby girl couldn't protect herself from her mother. And the medical evidence suggested that no one else had intervened to protect her either, allowing the abuse to continue until her injuries became life-threatening. Let's break down what we know about her injuries, because understanding the medical facts helps us grasp the severity of what this child endured. Multiple fractures, broken bones. In an infant, bones don't break easily. They're somewhat flexible, and normal handling or even minor accidents rarely cause fractures. When an infant has multiple fractures, it's a major red flag for abuse. The fractures can be in different bones, arms, legs, ribs, and they may be in different stages of healing, which tells medical examiners that the injuries occurred at different times. This pattern indicates ongoing abuse, not a single incident. Hemorrhages. Internal bleeding. This occurs when blood vessels are torn or ruptured due to trauma. In infants, hemorrhages can be particularly dangerous because their small bodies can't tolerate much blood loss, and bleeding in or around vital organs can quickly become life-threatening. Retinal bleeding. This is damage to the blood vessels in the back of the eye, and it's commonly associated with abusive head trauma, often from violent shaking. The medical term is shaken baby syndrome, or abusive head trauma. When an infant is shaken, the brain moves back and forth inside the skull, causing blood vessels to tear and resulting in retinal hemorrhages, brain bleeding, and potentially permanent brain damage or death. The combination of these injuries in a 3-month-old infant is diagnostic of severe, repeated physical abuse. This wasn't rough handling or overly vigorous play. This was violence directed at a helpless baby. Medical professionals who treated the infant immediately reported their concerns to law enforcement and child protective services, as they're legally required to do. An investigation was launched, focusing on the people who had care of the child, primarily Brianna Burkhart, the baby's mother. Investigators would have interviewed Burkhart about the baby's injuries, asking for explanations. Often in these cases, abusers offer implausible stories. The baby fell off the couch, or rolled off the bed, or was accidentally dropped. Explanations that medical evidence clearly contradicts. A fall from a low height, for instance, might explain a single injury, but it cannot explain multiple fractures in various stages of healing combined with hemorrhages and retinal bleeding. The investigation gathered medical records, photographs of the injuries, expert medical testimony, and other evidence building a case against Burkhart. Child Protective Services likely removed the baby from Burkhart's care immediately, placing her with foster parents or other family members where she would be safe. But for this little girl, even being removed from her mother's care came too late. Despite the medical treatment she received, despite the care and attention of doctors and nurses who fought to save her, the baby's injuries were too severe. She died. The death of an infant from abuse is classified as a homicide, death at the hands of another person. And in this case, the evidence pointed to Brianna Burkhart as the person responsible. On November 7, 2024, more than 6 months after the baby's death, a grand jury indicted Burkhart on murder charges. The indictment meant that the grand jury had reviewed the evidence and determined that there was probable cause to believe Burkhart had murdered her daughter. The delay between the baby's death in April and the indictment in November is not unusual in complex cases like this. Investigators needed time to gather all medical records, consult with experts, interview witnesses, and build a comprehensive case. The death of an infant requires an autopsy, toxicology screening, and detailed analysis of all injuries to determine the cause and manner of death. This process takes time. But finally, 7 months after that April day when a dying baby was rushed to the hospital, Brianna Burkhart was formally charged with her daughter's murder. The case now proceeds through the Kentucky criminal justice system. Burkhart will have the opportunity to mount a defense, though given the medical evidence, that defense will face significant challenges. She may claim that someone else was responsible, that she wasn't present when the injuries occurred, or that there's some medical explanation for the baby's condition other than abuse. But prosecutors will present the medical evidence, expert testimony, and other facts that point to Burkhart's guilt. The question that haunts everyone who learns about this case is the same question that arises in every case of infant abuse. Why? What drives a mother to hurt her own baby? Postpartum depression affects many new mothers, causing sadness, anxiety, and feelings of being overwhelmed. In rare cases, postpartum psychosis can cause delusions and a break from reality. But neither condition typically results in the kind of sustained, violent abuse seen in this case. Substance abuse can impair judgment and reduce impulse control, but even most parents struggling with addiction manage not to repeatedly break their infant's bones. Sometimes, tragically, the answer is simply that some people, even some mothers, are capable of extreme violence against the most vulnerable. Whether due to personality disorders, a history of their own abuse, a lack of empathy, or factors we don't fully understand, a small percentage of parents abuse their children in ways that defy rational explanation. What we know is that for 3 months, Burkhart's baby girl experienced not the warmth and security that infants need, but pain and violence. She suffered injuries that would be agonizing for an adult and must have been unbearable for a tiny infant. She cried out, presumably, but those cries brought not comfort, but more abuse. And then she died, her brief life marked by suffering inflicted by the person who should have loved and protected her above all others. The medical professionals who cared for this baby in her final days were undoubtedly affected by the case. Doctors and nurses who work in pediatrics choose that specialty because they love caring for children, and cases of child abuse are particularly difficult for them to handle. They work to save a child's life while knowing that the injuries were preventable, that someone deliberately hurt this baby, that the very system designed to protect children, parental care, failed catastrophically. As Brianna Burkhart awaits trial, that 3-month-old baby girl remains a statistic in Kentucky's child abuse deaths, a number in a report, a case file in a prosecutor's office. But she was more than that. She was a person, a baby who should have lived, who should have had the chance to grow and develop and experience life. Her death demands justice. It demands accountability. And it demands that we, as a society, do better at protecting infants and recognizing the signs of abuse before it becomes fatal. If this case moved you, please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and share it with others who care about child welfare. Together, we can raise awareness and potentially prevent the next tragedy. Case 7. Jamie Hendriksen, the Adair County Mystery. On August 29, 2023, in rural Adair County, Kentucky, law enforcement responded to a call that would lead to a child death investigation and murder charges against a mother. Jamie Hendriksen's 3-year-old child had sustained fatal injuries, and the circumstances surrounding the child's death would lead authorities to determine that this was not an accident, but a homicide. The details of this case remain somewhat limited in public reporting, partly because the investigation and legal proceedings are ongoing, and partly because Adair County is a small, rural area where major crimes receive less media coverage than they might in urban centers like Louisville or Lexington. What we do know paints a disturbing picture. A 3-year-old child, old enough to talk, to express themselves, to have developed a personality and relationships, died from injuries sustained while in their mother's care. And those injuries were severe enough that law enforcement determined they constituted murder, not an accidental death, or even manslaughter. 3 years old is a magical age in child development. Children at this age are becoming little people with distinct personalities. They're learning language rapidly, asking constant why questions, asserting their independence while still needing parental guidance and protection. They're enrolled in preschool or daycare, making friends, learning to share and cooperate. They're developing motor skills, running and jumping and climbing. They're curious about the world and eager to explore it. A 3-year-old should be safe at home with their parent. Home should be the safest place in a child's world, a refuge from danger, a place of comfort and security. But for Hendriksen's child, home was where they encountered fatal violence. The nature of the child's injuries hasn't been disclosed in detail in public reports, which is common in ongoing criminal cases to preserve the integrity of the trial. But the fact that Hendriksen was charged with murder tells us several important things. First, the injuries were clearly not consistent with an accident. Medical examiners can distinguish between accidental injuries and those resulting from abuse. The pattern, location, and severity of injuries provide clues about how they occurred. If this had been an accidental death, a fall downstairs, a drowning, a car accident, Hendriksen likely wouldn't have been charged with murder. Second, prosecutors believe they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Hendriksen caused her child's death through criminal conduct. Kentucky law defines murder in various ways, but generally, it requires either an intentional killing or conduct that shows extreme indifference to human life and results in death. For prosecutors to bring murder charges, they must believe the evidence supports one of these theories. Third, there likely were no other credible suspects or explanations for the child's death. If there had been another adult in the home, or if there were questions about who was responsible, charges might have been delayed pending further investigation. The fact that Hendriksen was charged relatively quickly suggests that the evidence pointed clearly to her responsibility. Adair County is located in south-central Kentucky, a rural area known for its rolling hills, small towns, and close-knit communities. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where a child's death sends shockwaves through the entire county, where people who never met the victim nonetheless mourn because in a small community, every tragedy is deeply felt. The local community's reaction to the case has not been extensively documented in media reports, but we can imagine the grief, shock, and anger that residents must have felt. In small towns, children are often everyone's children. Neighbors watch out for each other's kids, teachers know their students' families, and the loss of a child affects the entire community. Jamie Hendriksen's case is working its way through the Kentucky court system. She'll have the right to a trial by jury, the right to present a defense, the right to challenge the prosecution's evidence. The legal process will unfold over months or potentially years, with pretrial hearings, motions, and eventually either a plea agreement or a trial. During this process, more details about what happened to that 3-year-old child will likely emerge. Evidence will be presented in court. Witnesses will testify. Medical experts will explain the child's injuries and how they were sustained. And ultimately, a jury will decide whether Jamie Hendriksen is guilty of murder. But regardless of the legal outcome, one fact remains unchangeable. A 3-year-old child is dead. That child should be 5 years old now, preparing to start kindergarten, excited about riding the school bus for the first time, making new friends, learning to read. Instead, that child's life ended at 3, cut short by violence in what should have been a safe home. The Hendriksen case, while less detailed in public reporting than some others we've discussed, nonetheless represents the same fundamental betrayal, a mother's failure to protect, and indeed her alleged actions to harm, her own child. It's a reminder that these tragedies occur not just in cities but in rural areas, not just in troubled families known to social services, but sometimes in families with no prior red flags. It's a reminder that we cannot assume children are safe simply because they're with their parents, and that vigilance and intervention are necessary to protect the vulnerable. As this case proceeds, the people of Adair County await justice for a 3-year-old who deserved so much better than the fate they met. And across Kentucky, this case serves as another painful reminder of the ongoing need to protect children from the very people who should be their greatest advocates. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you can stay updated on this case and others like it as they develop. Case 8. Kaitlyn Renee Higgins, the Trunk Horror. On April 20th, 2021, Louisville Metro Police made a discovery that would horrify even the most seasoned investigators. Inside the trunk of a car, they found the body of a 10-year-old boy. And the person responsible for his death, the person who admitted to shooting him and then attempting to mutilate his body before hiding it in that trunk, was his own mother, Kaitlyn Renee Higgins. This case stands out even among the catalog of maternal horrors we've examined because of its combination of violence, premeditation, and the disturbing actions Higgins took after killing her son. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of rage that spiraled out of control. The sequence of events suggests calculation, planning, and a consciousness of guilt that led Higgins to try to conceal what she had done. 10 years old. Let's pause to consider the victim in this case. At 10, children are in 4th or 5th grade. They're developing their own identities, discovering their interests and talents. They have friends, hobbies, favorite subjects in school. They're old enough to have complex thoughts and feelings, to understand their place in the family and the world. They're transitioning from childhood toward the preteen years, still needing parental guidance, but beginning to develop independence. A 10-year-old knows their mother. They've spent a decade with her, forming a bond that should be one of the strongest in human experience. They trust her, depend on her, look to her for love and support. The idea that a mother would turn on her 10-year-old child, would point a gun at them and pull the trigger, is almost incomprehensible. But that's exactly what Kaitlyn Higgins did. According to police reports and charging documents, Higgins shot her son. The details of how this happened, where they were when she pulled the trigger, whether there was an argument first, whether the child saw it coming or was taken by surprise, are part of the investigation and court proceedings. What we know is that after shooting her son, killing him, Higgins didn't call for help. She didn't call 911. She didn't rush him to a hospital in a futile attempt to save his life. Instead, she made decisions that demonstrate awareness of her crime and a desire to conceal it. She attempted to mutilate the body. The word mutilate is clinical, but it masks a horrifying reality. Higgins, according to her own admission, tried to alter her son's body after death. Was she trying to prevent identification? To obscure the cause of death? The reasoning is unclear, but the action itself speaks to a level of depravity that goes beyond even the murder itself. Then she placed her son's body in the trunk of her car. She wrapped up the child she had carried for 9 months, the child she had raised for 10 years, and she put him in a trunk like a piece of luggage, like garbage to be disposed of. How long did the body remain in that trunk? Hours? Days? What was Higgins doing during this time? Was she driving around with her dead son's body in the trunk, going about her daily life? Was she trying to figure out how to dispose of the body permanently? Was she paralyzed by fear of being caught? Eventually, police were alerted. Perhaps someone reported the child missing. Perhaps Higgins's behavior raised suspicions. Perhaps she was stopped for a traffic violation and officers noticed something amiss. However it happened, police discovered the body in the trunk and Higgins was taken into custody. During questioning, Higgins admitted what she had done. She confessed to shooting her son. She acknowledged attempting to mutilate the body. She admitted to placing it in the trunk. These admissions, combined with the physical evidence, gave prosecutors a strong case. Kaitlyn Higgins was charged with murder. In Kentucky, the murder of a child by a parent is treated with particular severity. The law recognizes that parents have a special duty to protect their children, and when that duty is not just neglected but actively violated through violence, enhanced penalties may apply. The Louisville community, already reeling from high rates of violent crime, was particularly shaken by this case. A 10-year-old child, murdered by his mother, his body hidden in a trunk. It was the kind of story that generated headlines, that prompted outrage, that led to discussions about what could drive a mother to such an act. What was happening in Kaitlyn Higgins's life that led to this moment? Was she suffering from mental illness? Had she experienced a psychotic break? Was she under the influence of drugs or alcohol? Had there been prior incidents of abuse or violence toward her son that went unreported? These questions matter not to excuse her actions, but to understand them, because understanding is the first step toward prevention. If Higgins was struggling with mental illness, were there resources available that she didn't access? If there had been prior abuse, why didn't anyone intervene? What systemic failures, if any, allowed this situation to escalate to murder? The case also raises questions about gun access. Higgins obtained a firearm and used it to kill her son. Was the gun legally purchased? Was it stored safely, or was it easily accessible? Kentucky has relatively permissive gun laws, but those laws assume responsible ownership. When a mother uses a gun to murder her child, it forces us to confront the intersection of gun rights, mental health, and public safety. As Higgins's case proceeds through the courts, her son's family, his father, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, must grapple with an unimaginable loss. Not only is a beloved child gone, but he was taken by his own mother in circumstances so horrific that they defy comprehension. The boy's classmates and teachers, who knew him as a student, a friend, a bright young person with his whole life ahead of him, must process the reality of his violent death. Counselors were likely brought in to help children and staff deal with the trauma of losing someone they knew in such terrible circumstances. And the broader Louisville community must reckon with yet another case of child murder, another reminder that children, even in their own homes with their own parents, are not always safe. Kaitlyn Higgins awaits trial or sentencing, depending on whether she has entered a plea. If convicted of murder, she faces a lengthy prison sentence, potentially life without parole. She'll spend decades behind bars, time she might use to reflect on what she did, though no amount of reflection can undo the harm. Her 10-year-old son, whose name has been withheld to protect his privacy, will never grow up. He'll never go to middle school, never learn to drive, never fall in love, never pursue a career, or start a family of his own. All those possibilities were extinguished when his mother pulled the trigger. The Higgins case stands as one of Louisville's most disturbing maternal filicide cases, distinguished by the premeditated nature of the cover-up attempt. Higgins didn't just kill her son in a moment of rage or mental breakdown. She then took deliberate steps to conceal the crime, demonstrating awareness and calculation that makes her actions all the more chilling. As we move forward, this case should prompt serious conversations about mental health screening for parents, about gun safety in homes with children, about the warning signs of escalating violence, and about the systems we have in place to protect children from harm. Because ultimately, that's what all these cases are about. Children who needed protection and didn't get it from the one person who should have provided it above all others. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support helps us tell these important stories and advocate for children who can no longer speak for themselves. Case 9. Daira Meijia Aguilar, The Secret Birth. In early July 2024, authorities in Jefferson County, Kentucky, which includes Louisville, investigated a case that combined elements of concealment, denial, and tragedy. A newborn infant, born in secret, hidden away in a trash bag, and later found deceased. The mother at the center of this case was identified as Daira Meijia Aguilar, a young woman who, according to reports, gave birth without medical assistance and then made decisions that would result in her baby's death and her own arrest. Cases of concealed pregnancy and hidden newborn deaths are more common than many people realize. Every year in the United States, dozens of infants are born in secret, often to young women who are afraid, ashamed, or simply unable to cope with the reality of pregnancy and childbirth. Sometimes these babies survive and are abandoned at hospitals, churches, or other locations where they'll be found and cared for. But sometimes, tragically, these secret births end in the infant's death. According to reports, Aguilar gave birth in secret. This means she didn't seek prenatal care, didn't tell family or friends about the pregnancy, and didn't go to a hospital or birth center to deliver. Instead, she went through labor and childbirth alone, presumably in her home, without medical supervision or support. Childbirth without medical assistance is dangerous for both mother and baby. Complications can arise quickly: hemorrhaging, infection, umbilical cord issues, respiratory distress in the newborn. And without immediate medical intervention, these complications can be fatal. Women who give birth alone also face risks to their own health and potentially their lives. After giving birth, Aguilar made a series of decisions that would ultimately lead to her arrest and prosecution. She placed her newborn baby in a trash bag. Then she concealed the baby in a closet. Later, the baby was moved to the trunk of a car, still in the trash bag. These actions suggest concealment rather than care. A trash bag is not a place for a baby. A closet is not a nursery. A car trunk is not a bassinet. Each of these locations speaks to Aguilar's intent to hide the baby, to keep the birth secret, to avoid the responsibilities and consequences of motherhood. But a newborn cannot survive such treatment. Without warmth, without feeding, Without the basic care that all infants require, death comes quickly. And for Aguilar's baby, that's exactly what happened. The newborn was later found deceased. The discovery of the dead infant prompted an immediate investigation. Authorities sought to determine the circumstances of the birth, the cause of the baby's death, and who was responsible. The investigation led them to Daira Meijia Aguilar, who was arrested and charged in connection with the infant's death. The specific charges Aguilar faces haven't been widely reported in mainstream media, and details of the case remain somewhat limited. This is partly because the case may still be pending, and partly because it didn't generate the same level of media coverage as some other cases, perhaps because it occurred in Louisville, which sees higher volumes of crime, or perhaps because details were kept confidential to protect the investigation. What we can discuss are the broader patterns and issues raised by cases like Aguilar's. Why do young women conceal pregnancies and give birth in secret? What drives them to hide their babies rather than seeking help? Fear is often the primary motivator. Fear of judgment from family or community. Fear of disappointing parents. Fear of religious or cultural consequences. Fear of an abusive partner. Fear of losing housing, education, or employment. For young women, especially teenagers or those in their early 20s, the prospect of revealing an unplanned pregnancy can feel overwhelming, even insurmountable. Denial also plays a role. Some women in concealed pregnancies engage in psychological denial, convincing themselves they're not really pregnant or that the problem will somehow resolve itself. They ignore or misinterpret the physical signs of pregnancy, and when labor begins, they're unprepared and panicked. But fear and denial, while they explain the motivation for concealment, don't excuse the outcome, because there are alternatives. Every state in the United States, including Kentucky, has a safe haven law that allows parents to surrender a newborn at designated locations, hospitals, fire stations, police stations, without fear of prosecution, as long as the baby is unharmed. These laws exist precisely to prevent cases like Aguilar's. They recognize that some women find themselves in desperate circumstances and need a way out that doesn't involve harming their babies. By providing legal immunity for safe surrender, safe haven laws offer an alternative to concealment and infanticide. If Daira Meijia Aguilar had known about Kentucky's safe haven law, if she had used it, her baby might be alive today. The infant could have been placed for adoption with a loving family. Aguilar herself would have avoided criminal prosecution. Instead, a baby is dead, and Aguilar faces serious charges. The tragedy of the Aguilar case extends beyond just the immediate facts. It raises questions about sex education, reproductive health access, and support for pregnant women, especially young, disadvantaged, or immigrant women who may face additional barriers to care. If Aguilar had had access to comprehensive sex education, might the pregnancy have been prevented? If she had had access to prenatal care without fear of judgment or deportation, might she have sought medical help? If she had known about safe haven laws and felt safe using them, might her baby have survived? These are the systemic questions that cases like this one force us to confront. Individual accountability is important. Aguilar made choices that resulted in her baby's death, and she must face consequences for those choices. But if we stop at individual accountability without examining the broader context, we miss opportunities to prevent future tragedies. Jefferson County authorities handled the investigation professionally, gathering evidence and building a case against Aguilar. The legal proceedings will determine her guilt or innocence, and, if she's convicted, her sentence. But for the unnamed newborn baby at the center of this case, the legal process comes too late. That infant never had a chance at life. Never took a first breath of fresh air, never felt sunlight on their face, never experienced human connection or comfort. Their brief existence was defined by concealment, by being hidden away as if they were something shameful rather than a precious new life. The Aguilar case reminds us that infanticide, the killing of infants, remains a problem even in modern, developed societies. It reminds us that some new mothers face overwhelming circumstances that can lead to tragic decisions. And it reminds us that we need to do better at supporting pregnant women, educating young people about their options, and making it safe and easy for desperate mothers to surrender their babies rather than harm them. As this case continues through the Kentucky court system, we should keep in mind not just the legal questions of guilt and punishment, but also the broader social questions of how we support vulnerable women and protect vulnerable infants. If you found this case thought-provoking, please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and share it with others who care about child welfare and women's health issues. Case 10. Laken Snelling, the closet concealment. Our final case brings us to August 27, 2025, in Lexington, Kentucky, the state's second-largest city, known for its horse farms, University of Kentucky campus, and generally safe, family-friendly communities. But on that August day, Lexington was the scene of yet another case of concealed infant death when authorities discovered the body of a newborn baby hidden in a closet in Laken Snelling's home. This case bears similarities to the Aguilar case we just discussed: another concealed pregnancy, another secret birth, another infant hidden away and found dead. But each case is unique in its details and circumstances, and Snelling's case has its own tragic elements that warrant close examination. Laken Snelling, like Aguilar, apparently gave birth in secret. The pregnancy was concealed, either through denial, deliberate hiding, or both. When labor began, rather than seeking medical help, Snelling gave birth alone, without assistance, without the safety protocols that modern obstetrics provides. And then, faced with a newborn baby and all the responsibilities that come with a new life, Snelling made a choice. She concealed the infant in a closet. How long the baby remained in that closet before being discovered isn't clear from public reports. Was the infant already dead when placed in the closet, having died during or immediately after birth due to complications? Or did the baby die from neglect while in the closet, from lack of feeding, warmth, or care? The medical examiner's report would have determined the cause and manner of death, information that would be crucial for prosecutors building their case. If the baby was born alive and then died due to Snelling's failure to provide care, that's one scenario. If the baby died during birth due to lack of medical assistance, that's another. Each scenario has different legal implications, though both result in serious criminal charges. What we know is that when authorities discovered the newborn's body in the closet, they immediately began an investigation. The circumstances were clearly suspicious. A concealed infant death demands thorough investigation to determine whether crimes were committed. The investigation led to Laken Snelling's arrest. She was charged with murder in connection with the newborn's death. Additionally, she was indicted by a grand jury, meaning that a panel of citizens reviewed the evidence and determined there was probable cause to believe Snelling had committed the crimes with which she was charged. The fact that Snelling was charged with murder, not just concealment of a death or abuse of a corpse, tells us that prosecutors believe they can prove she caused the baby's death through her actions or inactions, and that her conduct met the legal definition of murder under Kentucky law. Lexington, as Kentucky's second-largest city, sees its share of crime, but cases involving dead newborns are relatively rare and generate significant community attention. The local media reported on Snelling's arrest and the charges against her, and the community reacted with the familiar combination of shock, sadness, and anger that such cases provoke. Why does this keep happening? Why do young women continue to conceal pregnancies, give birth in secret, and hide their babies, even when safe haven laws offer a legal, safe alternative? The answer is complex and varies from case to case. But some common factors include psychological denial. Some women genuinely don't believe they're pregnant, even as their bodies change and labor begins. This isn't rational, but psychology isn't always rational. Denial can be a powerful defense mechanism, especially when facing an overwhelming situation. Fear and shame. The stigma around unplanned pregnancy remains strong in many communities. Young women fear their parents' reaction, their partner's response, their community's judgment. They imagine worst-case scenarios and convince themselves that hiding the pregnancy is the only option. Lack of knowledge. Despite widespread information about pregnancy and childbirth, some young women genuinely don't understand what's happening to their bodies or what their options are. Sex education varies widely, and not all young people receive comprehensive information about reproduction, pregnancy, and parenting options. Mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions can impair judgment and decision-making. A young woman struggling with mental illness may not be capable of making rational choices about her pregnancy. Abusive situations. Some concealed pregnancies occur in the context of abuse, a controlling partner who forbids the woman from seeking care, a family situation where revealing the pregnancy would result in violence or expulsion from the home. Immigration status. For women who are undocumented or fear deportation, seeking prenatal care or surrendering a baby at a hospital can feel impossibly risky. None of these factors excuse infanticide. A baby's right to life supersedes any mother's fear, shame, or difficult circumstances. But understanding these factors can help us develop better prevention strategies. We need comprehensive sex education that includes information about pregnancy, birth, and options for parents who feel unable to raise a child. We need to publicize safe haven laws more widely so that every young woman knows she has a legal way to surrender a baby safely. We need to reduce the stigma around unplanned pregnancy and make it safe for women to seek help. We need accessible mental health care and support services for pregnant women. These aren't easy solutions, and they won't prevent every tragedy, but they might prevent some. And given that we're talking about the lives of innocent newborns, even preventing some tragedies is worth the effort. Laken Snelling now faces murder charges in connection with her newborn's death. As her case proceeds through the Fayette County court system, Lexington is in Fayette County. She'll have the opportunity to defend herself, to present mitigating circumstances, and to have her case heard by a jury of her peers. But regardless of the legal outcome, one fact remains unchangeable. A newborn baby is dead, hidden in a closet instead of being cradled in loving arms. That infant never got to experience life outside the womb, never felt the comfort of being held and fed, never had the opportunity to grow and develop and become a person. The baby's death represents not just a legal failure, but a moral and social failure. We failed to create a society where Laken Snelling felt safe revealing her pregnancy and seeking help. We failed to ensure she knew about safe haven laws and felt comfortable using them. We failed to protect the most vulnerable person in this scenario, the newborn who had no voice, no choice, no advocate. As we reflect on this case and all the cases we've examined tonight, we must ask ourselves, what can we do differently? How can we protect vulnerable children? How can we support struggling parents before crisis becomes tragedy? How can we create a society where every child is wanted, protected, and given the chance to thrive? These are not easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they're questions we must continue asking, continue wrestling with, if we want to honor the memories of all the children whose stories we've told tonight. Thank you for watching this incredibly difficult episode of Cold Case Hour. If you made it to the end, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how we can better protect children, and share this video with others who care about child welfare. Together, we can raise awareness and potentially save lives. Tonight, we've journeyed through 10 of Kentucky's most disturbing cases of maternal violence. 10 stories of mothers who betrayed the most fundamental trust, who violated the most basic duty, who became not protectors but perpetrators. From Shaylynn Curtis, who hid her baby's body in an attic after he died of methamphetamine intoxication, to Laken Snelling, who concealed her newborn's body in a closet, we've seen the many forms that maternal violence can take. We've seen acts of impulse and acts of calculation, crimes of passion and crimes of concealment. We've examined cases involving infants just months old and children as old as 10. We've looked at deaths caused by drugs, by physical abuse, by neglect, by gunshots, and by concealment after birth. And through all these cases, one constant remains: innocent children, dead at their mother's hands. What have we learned from this dark journey through Kentucky's worst maternal homicide cases? We've learned that maternal violence crosses all demographic boundaries. These cases come from urban Louisville and rural Adair County, from families known to social services, and from families with no prior red flags. We've learned that the opioid crisis claims not just adult victims, but children. Children who are exposed to drugs, who lack proper care because their parents are addicted, who die because their mothers prioritized substances over safety. We've learned that mental illness, while it may explain behavior, does not excuse it. Some of these mothers may have been suffering from postpartum depression, psychosis, or other conditions, but their mental state doesn't change the fact that children are dead. We've learned that concealed pregnancies and hidden infant deaths remain a persistent problem, despite the existence of safe haven laws that would allow mothers to surrender babies safely and legally. We've learned that warning signs are often missed or ignored, that violence against children often happens behind closed doors, and that by the time authorities intervene, it's sometimes too late. But we've also learned that accountability is possible. Most of these mothers have been charged with serious crimes. Many have pleaded guilty or been convicted. Justice, while it cannot undo the harm, can at least acknowledge it and impose consequences. As we close tonight's episode, I want to acknowledge how difficult these stories are to hear. If you're feeling disturbed, upset, or triggered by these cases, that's a normal and healthy response. These are disturbing stories. They should upset us. They should trigger our protective instincts and our desire for justice. If you're a parent watching this, you might be holding your children a little tighter tonight, grateful for what you have and horrified by what others have lost. If you work with children, as a teacher, doctor, social worker, or in any other capacity, you might be reflecting on the responsibility we all share to protect vulnerable kids. And if you're someone who has struggled with parenting, with mental health, with addiction, or with overwhelming life circumstances, I hope these stories remind you that help is available and that reaching out is always better than staying silent. We can all play a role in protecting children. If you see signs of abuse or neglect, report them. If you know a parent who is struggling, offer support or help them connect with resources. If you work with children, be vigilant and remember that you are a mandated reporter. And if you're in a position to influence policy, advocate for increased funding for child welfare services, mental health treatment, and addiction recovery programs. The 10 mothers we've discussed tonight represent the worst of humanity, the betrayal of the most sacred trust, the violation of the most fundamental duty. But they also represent opportunities for learning, for improvement, for societal change that might prevent the next tragedy. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through Kentucky's worst cases of maternal murder. I'm your host, and this has been Cold Case Hour. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and remember, the best way to honor victims is to prevent more victims from being created. If this episode impacted you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this episode with others who care about child welfare. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories and raise awareness about child safety. Stay safe, everyone, and hold your loved ones a little closer tonight.